this invitation that offers me the occasion to talk about the first topic I dealt with while studying Knossian coinage, that is, the first issues of the city. Now I will try again to do the trick I did before. Is it working? Okay. So, before turning specifically to Knossos, some words should be spent on Cretan coinage in general. As one can easily imagine, working on Cretan mints implies a continuous shift from the single polis to the general framework of Cretan numismatics and vice versa. And as you all remember, Crete is labeled as the 100-city island given by Homer. So, as one can expect, we have more than 30 different mints working in Crete and some phenomena that are well attested in the coinage of the majority of these polis. As a consequence, many works on Cretan numismatics dealt with the island as a whole, and only in recent years some scholars started to study the activity of the mints of some specific polis, such as the ones of Polyrrhenia, Kydonia, Hierapytna, and Festos. By the way, concerning the wider scenario, there are some fundamental works on Cretan numismatics that constituted important turning points in the history of the Cretan numismatics. The first cornerstone for Cretan coinage is the work of Johannes Svoronos, Numismatique de la Crete Ancienne, that was published in 1890. The work was conceived as composed by two parts. The first volume contained the catalogue of all the coins issued in Crete that were organized by mint and preceded by a geographical and historical description, including also information about the local cults. The author recognized at least 61 mints, some of which of uncertain attribution, and the volume 1 was followed by more than 1,000 images gathered in 35 tables. It was an enormous work. The plan of Svoronos was to compose a second volume that was never published and that should have contained some specific studies concerning chronology, countermarks, and overstrikes. And you have here the summary on the right. The second fundamental work in Cretan coinage was published by Georges Lerider in 1966, so quite 70 years after Svoronos' book. Lerider studied 3 hoards confiscated in Crete at the beginning of the century, analyzing in depth some problems concerning Cretan coinages, such as the chronology and the phenomena of overstriking and countermarking, that are quite spread all across the island. The other 2 volumes appeared more recently, respectively in 2019 and 2020. The first is born from an exhibition concerning Cretan cities and their history through coins, while the second gathers the proceedings of a conference held in Athens in 2016 that gave the opportunity to rediscuss some issues concerning Cretan economy and society in Hellenistic period. So we have 2 complementary approaches, we can say. On the one hand, we have these general works, and on the other, some works on specific polis that studied in depth the activity of their mints. The history of the studies, however, left some problems unsolved. The weight standard in use on the island is the first, then the diffusion of overstriking and countermarking, and last but not least, the chronology of the first coins struck in the island. Concerning the weight standard, it seems to be a debased genetic standard, sometimes called also Cretan standard. And it is centered on a standard of about 11-12 grams, but these studies on the single mints, the ones I was mentioning before, are showing that, of course, each city had its own, let's say, interpretation of this standard. The wide use of overstriking in Crete had been already underlined by Lerider, who provided also a list of the overstruck samples he had found during his work. And you have here an example of the many samples he found. Countermarking is also very common in Crete, especially in the Hellenistic period, and you have here a chart from a preliminary study carried out some years ago, but just to have an idea of the amount of the countermarks we can find on the island. These 3 points, so the first 3 points of the list, are commonly explained looking at the absence of silver mines in Crete that would have caused Cretan cities to use a debased standard, thus also preventing their coins to trespass the borders of the island. Cretan cities also reused foreign coins, and so reused foreign silver, recycled foreign silver by countermarking or overstriking the coins. Concerning the last voice of the list, so the chronology, the main problem is the absence of stratigraphical data to rely on that forces us to adopt other evidence to date the first coins. And indeed, you can find, for example, the first coins of Knossos swinging between 500 BC and 425 BC. This brings us directly to our topic, that is the first coins of Knossos. I chose here to talk about the first 4 series issued by Knossos, that are the ones of the classical period, broadly speaking, and I divided the presentation into 2 parts. The first one provides, or tries to provide, a general overview on the archaeology and history of Knossos between the 7th and 4th centuries BC, while the second part is a specific focus on the coins of Knossos. The idea is to provide a framework for the coin production on the one hand, while discussing on the other the coins themselves, and then try to piece up together the different data, but without forcing them. So let's start with the context, archaeological and historical context of Knossos. As it is well known, excavations at Knossos began in the late 19th century when Arthur Evans arrived in Knossos with the firm intention to find and excavate the Palace of Minos. He purchased at its own expenses a land previously in private hands, the hill of Kephala, and you have here one of the letters written by Evans authorizing his lawyer to buy the land. So Evans purchased Kephala and started the excavations, discovering the whole palace of Knossos. All his efforts focused on the sole target, the palace, leaving out the other archaeological levels. Thus, if now, thanks to Evans' excavations, we have a good knowledge about the Minoan phases of the city, much less is known about the later levels. And this means in turn that we have no archaeological evidence of the city where Knossian coins were effectively minted, at least if we look at this zone of the settlement. However, after the Second World War, new archaeological research were carried out, slowly shedding light on the later phases, and you have here some of the excavations, such as the ones at the Sanctuary of Demeter, and a fundamental survey project that was carried out in the 80s by Hood and Smith on the left, and on the right, a more recent survey project based on the territory of Knossos. Still, archaeological data concerning the period between 7th and 4th centuries BC are very poor, so that it has been long claimed that Knossos faced a phase of decline that is commonly labeled as the Archaic Gap, to be explained with some conflict with other settlements. The indicators of this gap can be listed in 3 points that are the absence of pottery pertaining to the 6th century, the abandonment of the burials, and the apparent abandonment of the settlement. However, these data have been recently reconsidered in the light of both specific studies on Knossos and more general studies on the emergence of the polis in Crete. A survey project focused on Knossos, the one I was mentioning already before, allowed to appreciate continuity in occupation of the territory, along with the presence of imported pottery from Attica, Laconia, and Corinth, while some studies carried out by several scholars have shed light on the processes leading to the emergence of the archaic polis in Crete. So, the apparent lack of evidence is probably to be related with visibility and not with a real crisis. This means that the fact that we cannot recognize the archaic and classical Knossos does not mean that it did not exist, but only that we do not have the tools to recognize it. To sum up, using the words of Knossos, the large-scale spatial organization attested in cemeteries, sanctuaries, and settlement that can be glimpsed but not fully appreciated, of course, thanks to the recent studies I was mentioning, should be interpreted as the reflection of an important phenomenon, usually described as the rise of the archaic polis. If we turn to the historical sources concerning Knossos and Crete between the 7th and 4th century BC, we are not particularly lucky. In fact, historical sources are almost entirely absent, probably due to the fact that the Cretans refused to take part in the Persian Wars, and thus were somewhat cut off from the historical literature of the time. I gathered the main events on the timeline, and as you can see, not the main events, I gathered the events actually on the timeline, and as you can see, they are really scanty. We have some news from literary sources, that are the ones in black, and a single information from the epigraphical record, this is the one in gray. Pardon, I don't know if you see, but I have an alert. Pardon. An interesting news comes, however, from Pindar, who mentions a certain Ergoteles who fled from Knossos to Agrigentum in Sicily because of a clash between city factions. This would seem to imply the existence of a structured and active city, at least in the second quarter of the 5th century BC. This impression seems to be confirmed by the existence of a treaty, labeled in gray, the last one on the right, made by Knossos, Argos, and Tilissos, a small city near Knossos, dated in the same years. A city capable to sign a treaty should have indeed had some consistency. These are the sole data we dispose of for the period of time we are dealing with. So, to sum up, with the general context, we have a framework, even if a bit faded, to put the coins in. We have some processes pre-announcing and preparing the rise of the polis in the 7th and 6th century BC. Then we have some events that confirm, or seem to confirm, the existence and consistence of the polis at the beginning of the 5th century BC. So let's now turn to the coins. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will deal with 4 different series, but I think the most interesting and probably fascinating one is the first series. The first series of Knossian coins bears a minotaur on the obverse and a swastika labyrinth, or sometimes a real maze, the one on the right, this one, on the reverse. As you'll remember, the myth talked about this horrible monster, half man and half bull, sent by Poseidon to punish the king Minos, who had offended him. So Minos asked the genius and architect Daedalus to build a special maze to imprison the monster, and Daedalus invented the labyrinth. So in this case, the badges chosen by the polis are totally unmistakable. Only Knossos could have chosen them. The legend is retrograde with archaic fonts and reads Knossian, that is of the Knossians. In this case, we have just Knos. We know stutters, drachms, hemidrachms, and obols of this series, and the standard, as already mentioned, is the reduced egenetic one. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the chronology of these coins is still debated, especially since we do not have stratigraphical data to rely on. There are, however, some elements, some different elements that we can consider, that are the style and legend of the coins, the overstrikes, and the hordes. The easiest, but also the most slippery, is, of course, the style. So as you can see, the minotaur is represented in a nearly running position that can be easily found in other coin types, but also in other kinds of representations ranging between at least the 7th and the 5th century BC. Not only the nearly running position, but also the hairdress and the perfectly defined muscles remind the stages of kuroi of the archaic period. Also, the use of the incus square on the reverse seems to suggest a high chronology for these coins. Concerning the legend, Knossian, Margherita Guarducci dated it to the beginning of the 5th century due to the archaic shape of the letters. Of course, one can think about some kind of conservatism both for the style and the font of the legend, but the Lectio Faciliors seems to suggest that this kind of representation and text were the current one when the coins were issued, so we could place them at the beginning of the 5th century BC. Besides, a very strict comparison can be found between the reverse of the fractions of Knossian coins, the one on the left, and some reverses from Miletus, issued between 550 BC and the beginning of the next century. The second element to be considered is the overstriking, a common practice on the island studied in depth by Derrida. Thanks to him, we dispose of a complete catalogue of restruck coins, and among them there are 2 minotaurs overstruck on Aeginetan statters with the windmill sail types that is dated before 500 BC. So also in this case, this is not, of course, a decisive proof, but it seems easier to imagine that the overstrike occurred not too far from the original production of the coins. The third element to be considered are the ords, and in particular there are the 3 ords that we already mentioned that were studied by Derrida, made of Cretan and non-Cretan coins that were confiscated during the last century in Crete. Relying on the non-Cretan coins contained in them, it seems possible to define a broad time span during which these 3 hordes were accumulated between the 5th and the 3rd century. Due to the large number of coins constituting the hordes, it does not seem possible to consider them as a quickly gathered emergency hordes, because in that case they would have presumably consisted of coins all belonging to the same period. It seems more likely that they are saving hordes made of coins issued and then collected over a long span of time. Well, our minotaurs are totally absent from the 3 hordes, and it seems that this could indicate that they were not in circulation, or at least not so much spread, when the hordes were created. Also in this case, the argumentum ex silentio cannot be decisive, but it seems to be in line with the other elements we collected so far. So, if we sum up this data, of course we cannot infer a definitive solution to the problem of the chronology, but it seems that the minotaurs could be placed without serious contradictions at the beginning of the 5th century BC. And if we consider the historical framework, we can remind that around 470 BC, but a little bit earlier, we have a stasis, the internal clash between factions who made Ergotares flee to Agrigentum, and the treaty involving Knossos and the other 2 polis, which both seem to indicate that Knossos was a structured city and thus was also able and capable to produce coins. Then one can imagine that once structured, the city chose as its coin type a very recognizable badge that claimed also for the pride and autonomy of the city. According to the, pride of autonomy of the city. According to the myth, the Minotaur was indeed fed with boys and girls that Athens was forced to send as a payment to Minos. So, behind the coin type, there is perhaps also the will to remark this mythical supremacy. So, the next question could be, why mint coins? Well, in this case, some hints can be inferred from the coins themselves, and some others should be found in the context. Looking at the coins, we can see that from the first beginning of the minting, Knossos chooses to produce not only big denominations, but also small fractions. This in turn should suggest that the destination of these pieces was different, and the rule normally says that the heaviest pieces could have been reserved for the city's public expenses, while the lightest ones could have been destined for minor and everyday transactions. Of course, the lack of a solid archaeological context makes it difficult to verify this impression, but some hints come from the epigraphical record. As it is well known, indeed, the Cretans had the habit to write down the laws concerning themselves, and even if for Knossos the epigraphical record is poorer if compared with other Cretan polis, we dispose of some texts concerning Knossian fines imposed in satires and drams, and this can suggest at least one of the uses of the official uses of these coins. So, if we pass to the second series of the classical period, we find that some changes occurred in the coin types. On the obverse, we find a female head with corn ears in her hair, that is probably Demeter, who had a sanctuary in the city's servitory, as we mentioned at the beginning. And on the reverse, we still have the swastika labyrinth. As you can see, there are many different renderings of both the obverse and the reverse, with, for example, different styles or a different number of dots in the middle of the labyrinth. That means probably a star. And we have different levels of accuracy. And on the reverse, we have sometimes a crescent instead of the stars, and sometimes this incused square with the swastika in the middle and crosses at the angles, and so on. Series 2, as you can see, shares the same type of obverse with Series 3. And Lerider detected also a die link between two coins. And this is the reason why I grouped them in a single slide. On the reverse, there is for the first time a square labyrinth, I'm talking of course about Series 3, accompanied by several symbols. Also in this case, we have various levels of accuracy, especially for the obverse, and sometimes we find the letters K and under the neck of the matter. Here, you have also here. The existence of the die link between series 2 and 3, detected by Lerider, seems to indicate that between these two series, not too much time passed. Also in this case, the chronology, of course, is not certain. But, as it has been already noticed, some of the female heads on the obverse show strict similarities with the head of Arethusa on Ewanetos coins in Syracuse. And this could offer a terminus postquem around 425 BC, at least for a part of this series. Also, these coins were found in the three hoards already mentioned before, so that we can hypothesize that they were in circulation when the hoards were collected between the 5th and 3rd century BC. Well, concerning the uses of these coins, it is interesting to underline two data. On the one hand, the absence of fractions, since we have only stutters in both series 2 and 3. On the other, the good amount of variations that even without a die study seem to suggest that these two series, had a substantial output. So, in the lack of a historical context, it is hard to imagine exactly what these coins were conceived for, but one could wonder if there was some specific expense linked maybe with the growth of the polis or with some conflict we do not know from other sources. Of course, I do not have the answer. So, for the moment, as we will see in a while, however, the gap left by the absence, of fractions was to be covered in a while with the introduction of bronze. So there is no time here to deepen this topic, but the types of the first bronze issues are very similar to the ones of series 2 and 3, thus suggesting that the introduction of bronze should have occurred in Knossos not too late after series 2 and 3. So for the moment, we can plausibly place series 2 and 3 around 425 BC, wondering what kind of expenses they were considered for, and pass to series 4. The fourth and last silver series of the classical period shows still the square labyrinth on the reverse and the head of Hera on the obverse. This series encompasses a good number of fractions bearing the head of Hera or Apollos on the obverse and a square labyrinth or a god on a labyrinth throne on the reverse. The interesting point here is that this coin type appears also on some coins of Argos, which does provide a useful terminus post quem for the coins produced in Knossos. The coins of Argos are dated by 365 BC and bear on the obverse the head of Hera and on the reverse two dolphins or Diomedes carrying the Palladium. It seems that the issue of the coins of Knossos bearing the same head of Hera should have occurred not too far from the production of the prototypes and could therefore be placed around the middle of the 4th century BC. Also, the city of Tilissos, that lied to the west of Knossos, used the same coin type for her coins. As I mentioned before, we have a treaty between these three cities testified by two epigraphs, found respectively in Argos and Tilissos. The epigraph is dated to 450 BC circa, based on paleographic and historical evidence. Even without a specific proof, it seems likely that these coins could be connected to some renewal of the treaty itself or to some new relationship that bound the three cities. The interesting point in this case, I think, is that these coins are quite the only evidence concerning the life of Tilissos in the 4th century BC. To sum up, we have 4 silver issues in the classical period. All of them are struck following the reduced genetic standard, as it also occurred in the other polis of Crete during the 5th and 4th century BC. It seems that we can place the first series at the beginning of the 5th century BC, the series 2 and 3 around 425 BC, and the series 4 around 350 BC. Thus, the 4 series are distributed all along the 5th and 4th century and should have provided enough currency for the needs of the polis and its citizens. This means, on the one hand, public expenses and the expenses for the polis, such as, for example, the fines, and as we saw through descriptions, and maybe public works, wars, we don't know. On the other hand, there were, of course, some minor expenses, probably but not necessary private ones, that were paid with small silver fractions in the case of series 1 and 4, and after a while with the first bronze pieces. The production of bronze was very massive in Knossos and seems to have flanked the one of silver, continuing even after the end of silver coin production. It seems that the minting of bronze complemented the set of denomination issued by the polis, creating a complete supply of different values to meet the various needs of the city. To complete this scenario, the data regarding circulation of Knossian coins are very poor. One Knossian minotaur was found in the territory of Tilissos during the excavations led by Azidagis in the 19th century, and in recent years another minotaur was found during the excavations carried out by the Università di Padova in Cortin. Apart from these two specimens, coins of series 2, 3, 4, but not of series 1, which is the minotaurs, were part of the hoards we already mentioned that were unfortunately confiscated from the antiquities market, so we cannot infer anything from them. However, as a general rule, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the debased standard of Cretan coins prevented them to abandon the territory of the island. Thus, their absence outside Crete is not surprising. Deducing further on the coins and their uses based on the scarce data we dispose of seems imprudent. However, if we refer to the context from which we started, we can see that the poor data we dispose of seem not to contradict the idea of a city emerging at the end of the 6th century and proudly minting its own coins from the beginning of the 5th century onwards. The coins were probably minted intermittently, as it is normal for ancient means that functioned to meet specific needs. Concerning the identity of these needs, they should have been internal needs, both public and private, we can say, and perhaps also commercial transactions. Research in recent years has helped to define Crete's role within Mediterranean trades that extended from Asia Minor, Greece, and northern coasts of Africa. Within this sea route, various Cretan cities served as stopover ports. And I placed here this slide as a sort of suggestion because we have some coin types that seem to be shared between Cretan polis and polis of the Near East, let's say. But we cannot go in depth with this because I have not so many points to talk about this. It is just a suggestion, but there are many different Cretan polis doing this, so we can think about it. In the specific case of Knossos, it has already been mentioned that the presence of ceramics imported from Laconia, Attica, and Corinth seems to indicate contacts, even direct ones, with these territories. Moreover, useful information about the importance of the trades by sea and by land come from the treaty with Argos and Tilissos, which we have already mentioned, and which includes regulations on exports and imports by land and sea. To quote Didier Vivier, the establishment of the same conditions for both Knossian and Tilician citizens with regard to exports from Knossos and the establishment of a customs-free trade between the two cities suggests that these issues had been subject to acrimonious controversy in the recent past, or at the very least that a lasting peace agreement between the two polis presupposed a strict definition of the conditions of exchange. This could mean that a lack of such regulations would be the cause of grave imbalance. The treaty is just the first in a rich panorama that encompasses many different agreements between Cretan polis that all reveal a vivid attention to the taxes on import and export activities, indirectly testifying the importance of these transactions along with others that should have somehow involved coinage too. It is clear that the framework to defer to is a bit blurry, and it would be wrong to suggest an excessive role of coinage in these transactions. But at the same time, it seems impossible to completely deny that the use of coins, probably introduced to meet the internal needs of the city, what kind of needs we talked about before, social, economical, and political one, soon had to respond to practical needs that put the polis in direct connection with surrounding and distant territories. To conclude, it seems that even if many questions remain obviously open, the historical framework of the beginning of local minting in Knossos seems to be consistent with the coin production. Vice versa, coins themselves seem to be a good autonomous historical source that sometimes accompanies and sometimes supplies the history of the city when we lack of other information. And I'm thinking in this case of series 2 and 3 in particular. And also series 4 if we think about the possibility of a new treaty between these cities. So, what there is still to do? Well, a lot. On the one hand, we can progressively abandon the idea of a conservative society with a basic economy that refuses the use of coins. And I'm afraid that it is now time for the creation of a complete corpus of Knossian coins that will allow to have a die study, a fundamental tool to better understand the monetary policy of the city, and a little step forward for a better comprehension of the bigger scenario of Cretan numismatics. Thank you for your attention.